start is just, can you just tell us what you've been up to, right? So I know you as the guy from Clear Left, and then I remember that you went to Twitter. But since then you've done a lot of solo work, right? And now you're sort of speaking a lot about ethics and things like that. So what is it that you're all about at the moment? What's your kind of focus?
Sure. So I'm an independent designer, let's see, so my focus for the last 5 years has been ethical technology, the world of particularly emerging technology and the ethical implications of that. And that came about after I spent 3 years at Twitter. I was design manager in the UK, so heading up the London team there. And then a bunch of dot-coms, startups, etc. previously in my career. Yes, my focus has been on ethics, and particularly, let's say, within emerging technology, how do we actually bring ethical considerations into technology teams? I wrote a book called Future Ethics, which talks about a number of different ethical verticals, like, and one of those is about climate, because that struck me that was a particularly important ethical challenge, possibly the most important ethical challenge we face. So ever since that, I've been trying to consult with companies on this, doing training, giving talks, a lot of talks, too many talks actually. So for 2020, it's all about trying to find out how I have influence without having to travel quite as much, but that's a whole other conversation.
Right. Okay, so just more generally, when you said, it's bringing ethics into tech teams, straight to the point here, I suppose, but why did you feel that need? Are tech teams generally unethical or amoral?
Yeah, I think they are. They don't realize it. It's more, maybe it's more tech companies have those problems. I think the individual teams within them may well be alert to ethical issues, but generally haven't got much of a clue how to move that conversation on. I think if you go back to the first half of the decade, we were still very much enthralled to this techno-utopian ideal that the world was getting better because of technology. We'd had the Arab Spring in the early part of the decade, and that was the social media revolution, right? That was all about how networks were going to topple these hierarchies and dictatorships and autocracies. And the mobile internet was going to give the world's knowledge and people to us, to everyone at our fingertips. And we didn't really question, we didn't really interrogate, is that actually a good thing? We sort of just took it for granted that it was. But obviously the latter half of the decade, we found the tech industry has just served up just endless examples of ethical mistakes. You've got the Cambridge Analytica debacle at Facebook, you've had Google Photos labeling black people as gorillas, you've had Uber Grable, where they built essentially a bogus app to scam regulators so that regulators couldn't actually use the service properly. Even the Volkswagen emissions scandal, that was a software engineering hack.
Oh gosh, yeah, about it. Yeah.
So that's a tech team problem, right? That's a software problem. And it's not that we weren't making these mistakes before, but I think as the scale and the power of the industry has accelerated, the moral implications of our decisions has also got a bit more. They've got a bit more intense, and also the press is very, very much more keen to pick the industry up on its failings. Partly as a result of this, speaking truth to power, but also partly because, frankly, the tech industry has eaten journalists' lunch, so they're happy to put a few jabs in as well. And so the public sentiment is starting to shift as well, and that saddens me greatly.
The couple of examples you mentioned, like the Volkswagen one, for example, right? That seems a mixture of, on one hand, tech team, right? Because there was obviously like some software engineers who implemented some piece of code there.
Yeah.
but it was also clearly something which was not tech driven, right? In a sense that, well, I mean, I say clearly from my recollection and my sort of assumptions, right? But it seemed like there was a decision taken at some kind of executive level, right? Which the person might have been a tech engineer person, but the purpose wasn't a technological one. It wasn't like for the advancement of some kind of technology or so on. So how common is that in what you're seeing? Is it different to the stuff we see in like the Google Photos thing you mentioned?
No, it's very similar. The fairly obvious primary cause of ethical mishaps is perhaps an understatement, but ethical mishaps in tech firms is a desire to earn more money. You know, it's driven by the profit imperative. It's driven by a desire to increase market share, to earn more value, to escape from regulation that might be, you know, harmful to your future interest, and so on. So I mean, it's common to the point of being default that yes, you know, these lapses mostly come from some business imperative. Now there are some biases and ethical problems that happen just, you know, more as a result of the way the technology is structured and the lack of interrogation afforded to that. I mean, the Google Photos thing, that wasn't done for money, right? There was clearly no money in being explicitly racist for Google. It was just they hadn't stopped to consider whether the algorithm was properly debiased.
Well, there's money in the sense that it's like ship it, right? It's like if we're not shipping things, we're going to be beaten by somebody else. And if we have something that's sort of broadly ready to ship, let's ship it and see what happens.
Yes, there's certainly a sort of secondary consequence there. And that also brings in things like agile and lean startup, which are, they're not just methods now within the tech industry, they're ideologies. They're, you know, as far as we're told, essentially, lean particularly is the only way to build. That you build, measure, learn, and you validate, and you know, sort of empirically iterate your way toward a solution. And there, yes, that is certainly driven by a perception that can mean more rapidity, more money, you know, quicker to market, all that sort of stuff. It's not a primary consequence of trying to earn more money. It's a secondary, but it's still a consequence nonetheless. Yeah.
So one of the, you mentioned in your book and the work you're doing at the moment, you're focusing on ethics, and climate is one of them, right? One of the focus areas. Just super generally, what are the other focus areas besides climate, just so that we know what we're comparing things to here?
Yeah, I'm sure.
Not comparing, just what the spectrum is.
Yeah. So the chapters in the book kind of mostly go from proximate threats to the far future ones. So data harms, privacy, algorithmic bias, redlining, all these sorts of things that are happening right now. I talk quite a bit about persuasive technologies because I think we haven't talked about persuasion enough when it comes to computing. We've seen things like the Facebook, again, Cambridge Analytica, but state-based interference in elections and trying to persuade people through particular interventions on social media.
State advertising, targeting dislikes, and sort of like the user habits that big companies are seeing and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. And sort of the extension of nudge to hyper nudge, as it's been called sometimes. If you build a full data profile about the individual, then you know exactly which buttons to push to get them to respond in a certain way. And does that person really have free will anymore? And from there, then I'd start talking about things like robot ethics. And so how do we coexist with robots rather than just use them? What are the right power relationships to be in there? And then we get onto the interesting stuff around weapon automation, and climate. Those are more sort of large existential problems. And then, of course, there's a little bit about the far future of AI and singularity and general and super intelligence as well.
This is all super interesting stuff, right? And I'm sort of tempted to just dig into all of them, but let's not do that just yet. We'll save that for something else. So what do you say in your book, and just generally, like, how does climate fit in? So an interesting thing that sprang out to me, all the things you mentioned seem to be very technological things, right? So for example, privacy is something which we can kind of understand, you know where your location is, you're submitting data, are things safe, things like that. Climate seems a bit more detached from something that a designer or a programmer might be doing. Mm-hmm. So how are you bringing that into the mix? What's the climate responsibility and impact?
Well, the thing about climate change is it's totalitarian, right? It stretches across every single aspect of every single person's life, and will do for the coming decades. It's not an issue so much as an era, right? It's a backdrop for everything that comes next. And you're right that it's a broader thing than just the world of technology, of course, compared to something like privacy or killer robots or whatever it might be. Nevertheless, with data centers now use this or create the same amount of emissions as the aviation industry globally, we absolutely have a role to play in this. So although it may not be an issue we immediately consider to be the role of technologists, given the looming crisis and given the amount of change that we require, if technologists don't play their part, then we may well not succeed.
Okay, so what is the part that the technologists need to play?
Well, there's a lot contained in it. But, I'm going to start with, again, an ideological perspective here.
Sure.
Seeing as we were talking about sort of ideologies first. Probably the biggest challenge and the biggest reason we've got into this mess is the way we've evaluated the world around us and the way that we have considered it as material to be used, resources to be exploited for the progress of the human race. And that is a technological concern. I'm not talking, technological in terms of just chips here. I'm talking, forests raised for development or for power plants or, whatever it might be. Technology in its broader sort of innovation sense.
Well, the whole industrial revolution is part of technology, and there's a very strong argument. The evidence is all pointing towards that being a core contributor, right?
Yeah. And, I'm a designer by trade, and design originated from the Industrial Revolution. It didn't exist as a separate discipline from craft until that separation of labour that happened in the Industrial Revolution. So we have contributed to this separation of humanity and nature by seeing nature as something that we can exploit. I think Heidegger, who you have to kind of caveat and say Heidegger is very problematic. He was an outright Nazi. However, some of his theories are still taken seriously. But he talks about how technologists saw the River Rhine and they saw, well, that's material that we can harness. We can make use of that, energy source for our own benefit. And so we see the world around us as something to be mined and exploited and stripped. And that includes our environment, it includes animals, it includes natural resources, minerals, and so on. Yeah. And so the tech industry is very much part of that. And so we try to drive people, say, well, get the latest device, get the hot new app. Well, you need rare earth minerals for that. You need CO2 in the manufacture. You need, all sorts of distribution, etc., and the generation of electricity to power these things. And that's not really discussed, how much of that responsibility lies on us to create that consumer demand.
Okay, so let me get back to that in a couple of minutes. But what's the reaction? What's the reaction you're getting from the companies or people you speak to? Right? Are they just what are these tech teams or companies? What are their response to this? For example, your explanation of how tech has contributed to a separation of sort of humanity versus nature, and all this kind of what you just went through.
Yeah, to be slightly sort of blasé about it, the response is usually, oh well, that's interesting, but should we make our websites black instead of white? Does that mean it uses slightly less power? They want to focus on these very trivial things like, oh, you know, who do you use to offset your flights and things like that. It's like, okay, sure. I mean, I'm glad you're asking those questions, but that is surface level stuff.
Okay.
That is nowhere near the deep change.
What is the deep change? Because there is the danger, right, of like the I was talking to somebody who, I won't mention his name just yet, but he sort of didn't want to come and talk to us on this podcast just because the way he's sort of seeing things is that the logical kind of conclusion is, well, we shouldn't do tech, right? And certainly some people see it that way and some people argue for it, right? It's like, well, tech has caused all of this. There is no way of, you know, browsing a site or calling somebody on a phone without emitting CO2, I mean, at the moment at least. So really the answer is don't do it. And obviously that's problematic because even if it were the right answer, then you're going to end up with millions of people not having anything to do, right? So what is the deeper way of addressing this that is not trivial surface level? Where do I often take my flight?
I mean, to address that first point, there are people now saying, well, the problem with user-centered design is it only focuses on users and ignores all other humans and all other species, which, yeah, true. So they say instead, well, let's have human-centered design rather than user-centered design. Okay, sure. But that still overlooks the planet, it still overlooks other species. So some people say, well, planet-centered design, life-centered design. You're right that the problem with that, the only logical conclusion is if you're evaluating whether we should be creating technologies by, do they improve the health of the planet or of life generally? No, they don't. Almost none of them do. So the conclusion has to be from that, if you're genuinely practicing life-centered design or planet-centered design, you should stop 90-something% of the work that our industry does. And that's very challenging for us because we've built our lives and our societies around that. So that's a very deep political question as well as a technological question. The deeper political change that we can get to the deeper environmental change that we can get to without wanting to tackle those important issues, which we should still tackle, but that's a broader question than just this call. Does this need to exist, right? Do we need, so I'm Helen Walters, she's a design critic. And it always stuck with me. She went to CES, the Consumer Electronics Show, back in 2011. And this was right at the start of tablet mania, right? The iPad was maybe 6 months old. Yeah. So everyone was releasing like Samsung and all these. And she said, well, I went to CES and there were 70,000 new products unveiled at CES, including like 80 tablets. And she pointed out, this isn't innovation anymore, this is vandalism. this idea of having to clutter the market with undifferentiated crap is a problem. Now, you could argue that the fewer products we have, well, you'll still sell the same numbers. It will just be, 4 companies rather than 80 companies. And maybe that's the case. But, in that case, there'll be economies of scale from manufacture and things like that that should improve things. Mm-hmm. But it comes down to this happiness that I see in the field to create me too, not in the, back in the old sense, not in the, in the new framing that phrase is.
Yeah, I know what you mean, yes.
Me too, fast follow, undifferentiated crap. That's the kind of work that I think we should pause and at least try to challenge our companies to say, well, maybe we don't need this. Maybe this shouldn't be built in the first place. That's probably the most fundamental. And of course, then there are more tactical strategies around making sure that all of our data centers use renewables, for example, and switching away from high polluting AWS instances to better alternatives. Thinking about packaging and distribution and all manufacture processes and everything like that. But without addressing that fundamental question of should we even then again, I worry it might become a bit surface layer, some of that stuff.
Okay, so you seem to be not quite, but this crosses over very much with the sort of startup culture that we have in tech a lot, right? Where this is just not a consideration at all. It's just, I've been to so many accelerators, hackathons, incubators, conferences, and I'm sure you've been to many, many more than I have. And this is not an issue. That it just never comes up. The question of should this exist only comes up in the context of, can we beat the competition, right? Or is this, if this exists, are we going to be profitable? Is there a big enough market? Like, that's the only sort of. Are you speaking to these people? Do you speak to investors and angel funders and incubators about these matters? Is there an appetite for even talking about this stuff?
I think there's a niche appetite. I mean, you're right that the question of should this exist is never asked. It's always just, is the market ready for it? You know, it's taken as granted that this product is a good thing. It's just, oh, we couldn't find a way to commercialize it. I think there are some investing, units and funds that do prioritize this stuff. And I from what I hear, it is trickling more into the discourse of venture capital and so on. But I don't speak to those folks all that often. Okay. I find my interest, preferences, influence, or whatever, are all stronger among practitioners.
Designers primarily.
Yeah, designers and software engineers, okay. And product managers to an extent. Product managers are the people I really want to reach, bluntly.
But they tend to decide a lot as to whether something should or shouldn't exist, right? Product managers and founders and CEOs are the...
Ultimately, they carry most of the ethical weight, I would say. I mean, design bears a lot of it, but, it's usually a product manager whose head is on the line around a certain cause. So they're bearing the risk. And so sometimes they are tempted to cut ethical corners as a result. And I say this with, good intentions. My wife is a product manager. Some of my best friends are, and all that sort of stuff. So I have to get those caveats out of the way. But yeah, a lot of the time when I see ethical corners cut, it comes from a product decision. Yeah.
Okay. And so, what is your advice to these people? Just to kind of wrap up this bit, right? Around, because you're saying the fundamental question is that you need to ask whether this needs to exist. Mm-hmm. What do you need to look for to get to an answer, right? Because if you ask me, does this need to exist? And I say, yes, it's going to make me a shit ton of money. So the answer is yes. But clearly that's not the only axis you're suggesting we're looking at. So what else what are the factors that you're suggesting people take into account when answering that question?
Sure. There are two. And there's a diagram I keep drawing these days because it seems to have got some traction. You've got essentially just two-axis diagram. On the x-axis, you've got the time axis, and on the y-axis, you've got what I call actors. The time axis is fairly straightforward, and we tend in the tech industry to focus mostly on the here and now. How does this, if I use this product, what do I get from it? How does it respond? Or maybe we stretch and say, well, what's going to be in version 2 in 6 months' time? But we don't really consider the longer lifespan of technology. I'm not just talking about the materials now, but I'm talking about, we spend so much time on onboarding, but we never talk about end of life. How does a product die? Does it get recycled? How do you close accounts? Things like that. So it's all about, for me, on that axis, saying what might be some of the unintended consequences in 6 months, in 2 years, even in a couple of decades of this decision. Mm-hmm. And just because those are unintended consequences, it doesn't mean they're not foreseeable. Doesn't mean they're unforeseeable. So we can use techniques to try and draw out what some of those consequences might be. And we can then try to mitigate those. We say, we hadn't even realized this might cause this problem, and that might, second order, third order, this may create this, which is a real ethical challenge. and you build that into your design process, right? You say, well, let's try and minimize some of that risk as you go. So that's the kind of x-axis, and there are techniques, particularly from speculative design, from futures thinking, strategic foresight, that can help tease those things out. The other axis, then, this one I'm talking about on the y-axis, that's what I've called actors, but you could call it scope as well. This idea of, again, coming back to this user-centered, human-centered, etc., saying doesn't just matter. We're not just focusing now on, or we shouldn't just focus on whether this is good for users. We have to take a broader view of, is this good for human society? Mm-hmm. Is it good for other plant life and animal life on the planet? Is it good for the structures that we choose to preserve as humans? You know, democracy, you know, health, you know, sort of abstract concepts, free will, you know, things that are harder to pin down, but are still very much things that we want to try to preserve as humans. And then, of course, is it creating harms on a planetary and environmental level as well? So we have to say, it's no good just evaluating in one tiny quadrant of that wider spectrum. It may well make you a couple of $1 billion if you're enormously lucky. But if that comes at the expense of harming wide sections of society or other life on the planet or the environment, then that is theft from the future, essentially. Okay. It's not just, you know, it isn't a positive sum game where there's wealth creation here. You are extracting and reducing the potential of life elsewhere on the planet and in years and decades to come. And that needs
this is a bit similar to what, like, in certain places, when you're creating like a new civil engineering project, right, you need to do like an environmental and societal impact assessment. Now, it's debatable how well they're done and how much they're taken notice of, but it's that principle, right, where you're looking at everything from not just sort of like the shareholders in the company, right, but the broader sort of everybody who's affected, somehow impacted by your app or your product. So, you know, when you're talking about say you're talking about an interaction designer working at a small company, I don't know, or even a large company like Twitter, right? It's like somewhere, so Twitter or an agency like Clear Left, for example. Is this really making a difference? You know, what's the what's the impact a designer can have, or a product manager, by you know, doing this in their small little corner of Twitter or for their new client at their agency?
Technologists hold an enormous amount of power, more than almost any other sector. We get to shape what the future looks like and what it becomes. So I think that's a terrifically important role. I mean, there are others who, you know, artists and writers and so on, they will try to depict what the future could become as well. Politicians will talk about the future a lot as well, but very few of them, only some politicians, some policy people and so on, technologists, I think are probably the, you know, among the two most powerful sectors for creating the future. Now that can be hard to see, you know, when we're right in the middle of it, right? You know, there's always internal power struggles and you think, well, I'm just one designer within a team of 200, within a company of 4,000, what can I do? What we're seeing now, though, the most significant ethical lever that's being pulled right now is collective action among tech employees. We've seen particularly at Google with their reaction against Project Maven, but then the Google walkout as well. Now we're seeing Microsoft mobilizing against contracts with ICE, Palantir employees, Amazon employees putting together around climate action. It may seem that we're individually quite weak and vulnerable, but collectively we are mighty. And tech workers are having significant change on the ethical outcomes of tech giants right now. Now, the execs are going to bite back. And at the start of the decade, the next few years are going to be, I think, are almost going to hinge in our industry on this ongoing an escalating war between execs and tech workers, mostly on the grounds of ethics and politics. but believe you me, it's absolutely having an impact. So that one designer or product manager may feel individually isolated, but he or she will have allies at the company. And if they learn from, organizing and activism, those techniques to mobilize those folks and push for change, it does work. So yeah, I agree. It can look disheartening, but don't underestimate the power we have within our industry and then the power we have collectively.
Okay. I mean, it's when you start thinking about this topic, it's easy to flip-flop between the sort of like, on the one side you feel a bit sort of lonely, on the other hand you kind of feel that things can change. What's your view on what level of action is needed here, right? So when you say collective action, what do you mean? Do you mean like, following a Twitter account, or Extinction Rebellion kind of action? What are we talking? Do we need to boycott Facebook en masse for a couple of days to send a message, or is what collective action can we take in tech?
A phrase I keep coming back to these days is pull every lever. When it comes to climate, the threat is so great that we try everything, right? So we need people taking just the smallest action of, clicking a like button or putting a ribbon in their avatar, or, whatever it might be. And we also need people, frankly, going on strike in some places, or quitting their jobs, or even standing for office. If they have the safety and the privilege to be able to do so. I would never criticize someone for not being able to do that, because I don't know their circumstances. But if you have that luxury, maybe that's the strongest lever you can pull. But right now, it's the whole lot, right? We need everything. And it may well be that there's some escalator there. You start with changing the ribbon, and you find a way to coalesce a group around that. And so this, I think, for the tech industry is really interesting. How do we turn individual action into collective action? And then how do we turn collective action into system change? And those seams, I think, are where we ought to be focusing. So how do we build tools that help unify voices and amplify the right people and mobilize movements around things like climate or any other moral issue? But then how do we build the systems for that pressure to start to change the system itself? And that could be politically, it could be campaigning, it could be building petition sites, things like that, or it could actually just building the new infrastructure that the new system will need. If we want to get rid of this old system, we need some platform, and it can slot in, in a new way.
When you say platform system, what do you mean here? You mean capitalism?
Potentially, yeah. I'm wary of the ethical message becoming too tightly aligned with one political stance. Mm-hmm. I think there are some people who do that, and it weakens it, because it allows people to say, oh, it's just ranting from a particular political wing.
Yeah.
That said, I'm not going to disavow, I'm not going to pretend I don't have a political stance. Individually, I think capitalism is responsible for a great number of ethical harms, and clearly environmental harms. I am open to the idea that we might find new variants of capitalism that are less damaging. I'm skeptical, but I'm open. Maybe we need to find a completely new way of organizing society. Now, this is not where my level of expertise lies, and this I would defer to my politically active friends on that. But I think we need to be questioning systems that deep, for sure, because one thing's for sure, if we keep going on this trajectory, the future is unimaginably bad.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I'm not an expert on this stuff myself, to be honest. I'm sort of almost selfishly using some of these conversations to learn a bit more about. Certainly, I guess when something is longer than your lifetime, especially like if you're born into something, like we were born into a capitalist system, it sort of feels like it's the only way. But once you start looking around, my wife is an anthropologist, for example. There are tons of societies that don't work on a capitalist way. And I don't mean to romanticize them at all. They have their own
problems. Oh, yes, for real.
and certainly if you go back, just a couple of 100 years in Western society, capitalism was not the dominant way of trading in the same number of sort of nations that we have today, even nation states themselves. So things change faster than maybe we realize. Let me just ask you one last thing, and then we'll sort of wrap up there. So one thing, I'm really glad to start seeing these, organizations like within Google, the Google workers, Microsoft workers coming together, putting some pressure, and also others. There's quite a few, like Climate Action Tech, for example, and a few others like this. They're happening. But generally speaking, I've sort of seen a general unwillingness to really talk about this issue in software circles much, and I'm not sure why. I have a few theories, but I'd like to hear maybe from you why is this not a bigger topic already in software and design circles, like in our space, right, in tech, and what do we need to do to change that?
Are you talking now specifically about climate issues or ethical issues more broadly?
Climate, specifically climate, because we talk about other ethical issues more nowadays. For example, I've mentioned before, diversity and inclusion is a thing which has become a thing now. It's almost like fashionable to talk about it to some degree, which is not where we want to be. But
yeah, I mean, there's still a lot of work to be done on that, but for sure, there's slightly more currency in that conversation these days. Yeah. I don't want to get too sort of gloomy, but I think part of it is simply that people don't realize how bad things are.
Okay.
I'm reminded of David Wallace Wells's book, The Uninhabitable Earth. And the first sentence of that is, it is worse, much worse than you think. And I think there's still this general perception that, climate's bad, but we'll figure it out. It's like, no, right now we won't. Like, we are heading toward potential disaster here. And there's also maybe a falling back to that techno-utopianism that technology will solve it. That will create carbon capture systems, sequestration, whatever, aerosols or whatever thing. And, they may be part of the solution, but they will also come with their own unintended consequences, which may be gravely damaging. Yeah. And without reducing demand and emissions, then all they're ever going to do is counterbalance the problem. So that clearly can't be the only solution. But I think, technologists will tend to look at technology as a solution for everything. So that's part of it. And maybe the other reason is it just feels so distant, doesn't it? We deal in abstractions of pixels and information and code and behavior and things like that, and we don't see the smokestacks and the cooling towers pumping out whatever emissions or pollutants, because they're abstracted by modern society and yes, by capitalism and by the national grid and things like that. So all of this happens on the device, which is clean and glassy and wonderful and elegant. We don't see the coal being burned, the gas being extracted to create all of that. It has that distancing effect. Globalization has had that effect as well. So it just feels so removed, and it's hard to quantify. One of the most difficult things when you talk to anyone in this field is, people want to know, well, how much worse is it for me to use 4G than Wi-Fi, for example? Finding real data on that is really difficult because it stretches across so many points of infrastructure, and no one wants to talk about their emissions in that part of that journey.
And it's sort of also not the point in a lot of ways, I think. It's like there are a few things where there's some things where measuring can be the right approach, and there are a few other things where measuring is not everything. And I don't mean it's not the point.
I agree with that.
You need to know. You need to know if you want to offset, for example, then. But again, like the issue of offsetting isn't necessarily going to solve the problem.
No, you need to not emit in the first place, really. I mean, I offset on my flights now, but it's still better if I didn't fly at all.
Exactly. Okay, well, let's wrap it up there on that not so Well, it's hard to know how to wrap up these episodes actually, because there's a sort of like it sort of feels like either you need to be ridiculously optimistic or else ridiculously depressed about the whole thing.
I'd like to talk about that if that's okay.
Go for it, yeah, for sure.
Because I think that might be an interesting way to wrap up the conversation. I speak with quite a few people who are wrestling with these issues. As you can imagine, they sort of come to me and they say, what are you up to? What can I do in this situation? And a lot of them struggle emotionally with it because it's, climate activists know all about this. Climate scientists have been dealing with the depression that comes with that for a long time. And that sort of, feeling that you're predicting the end of the world and just no one's listening. This is why that collective action is so important. This is why we have to draw on the strength of each other. And whenever I get into one of those funks, which of course, I absolutely do. And there are days sometimes I'm like, I can't actually do any work today. And luckily I'm independent, and so I can make up for that on Sunday or whatever. But the way you get over that is, I think, twofold. You recognize the power that we have to create the change. Like, we're in terrific positions to try to push this change through. As I said before, there are very few other people who can shape the future the way we can. So damn it, we'd better use that responsibility, properly. So that should be a positive, inspirational thing to realize. But the other thing is leaning on each other, and having those conversations when things do look grim and bleak, looking at the good work that other people are doing, looking at how much of their energy and their efforts they're putting into creating these better worlds, these better futures, and drawing inspiration from them, because they're going to need your shoulder to cry upon or to rest upon in a little while. So you take up the baton for a bit, but we're collectively in this. And you have bad weeks, you have bad years, but the community around us is striving for something greater, and that's what I draw strength from.
Hello, me again. Thank you for listening to the episode. I hope that was as interesting and useful for you as it was for me. As always, I encourage you to visit our website, fatalair.blog, to subscribe to our mailing list and find other ways to contribute and help us support the project. Thank you very much. I'll see you next time.